Imagine a world arguably as globalized, sophisticated, and interconnected as our own, and then, in the blink of an historical eye, it simply vanishes. For 3 centuries, writing disappears, great palaces burn, and silence falls over the Mediterranean. This isn't science fiction. It is the true, terrifying story of the first time the lights went out. Section 1. The Era of Superpowers, a Globalized Ancient World 2. Understand the magnitude of the catastrophe we are about to explore. We first have to shatter a common illusion. When we think of the distant past, 3,000 years ago, we often picture isolated tribes, primitive mud huts, and people who lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. We imagine a world that was small, disconnected, and simple. But the Late Bronze Age was none of those things. In fact, if you were to walk the streets of Thebes, Hattusa, or Mycenae in the 13th century BC, you would find a world that looks hauntingly familiar to our own. This was the era of the first true superpowers. Just as we have the G7 nations today, the ancient Near East had the Club of Great Powers. You had the Egyptians, the masters of the Nile, projecting gold and grain outward. To the north, in what is now Turkey, sat the Hittite Empire, a military juggernaut of iron discipline. To the east were the Babylonians and the Assyrians, the keepers of ancient wisdom and law. And across the sea, on the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans were building the legendary citadels that would one day inspire Homer's Iliad. These weren't isolated kingdoms, staring suspiciously at one another across empty deserts. They were partners. They were married into each other's families. We have recovered tablets, known as the Amarna letters, which preserved the diplomatic correspondence of this era. When you read them, you don't see barbarian warlords screaming for blood. You see bureaucrats and kings writing to one another, addressing each other as brother. They complained about late shipments of gold. They ask about the health of each other's wives, and they negotiate trade tariffs. It was a sophisticated international order maintained by treaties and embassies, and binding them all together was trade. This is the crucial piece of the puzzle. The entire technological basis of their civilization was bronze. But here is the catch. To make bronze, you need copper and tin. You can find copper in Cyprus, but tin was rare. It had to be shipped from as far away as modern-day Afghanistan, thousands of miles across rugged terrain and dangerous seas. This meant that no single empire could survive alone. The Hittites needed the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians needed the Babylonians. They had created a complex, transnational supply chain where raw materials, ivory, glass, and pottery flowed freely from the Indus Valley all the way to Spain. The ultimate proof of this sits on the bottom of the ocean off the coast of Turkey. The Uluburun shipwreck, dating to this exact period, was found carrying goods from at least 7 different cultures: amber from the Baltics, ebony from Africa, glass from Mesopotamia, and copper from Cyprus. It was a cargo ship of the globalized world. By the year 1200 BC, humanity had reached a peak of prosperity and integration that would be seen again for 1,000 years. It was a golden age of commerce, art, and stability. But in that very interconnectedness lay a hidden, terrifying danger. Because when you build a world where everyone relies on everyone else, what happens when just one domino falls? What happens when the tin stops arriving? They were about to find out that their greatest strength was also their fatal flaw. Section 2. Tremors before the quake, famine, rebellion, and a fragile peace, but apocalypses rarely arrive unannounced. Usually they send a warning first. Decades before the final fire, the engines of this great global machine began to sputter. While the kings were still exchanging polite letters and gifts of ivory, the ground beneath their feet quite literally began to shift. It started with the climate. We often think of climate change as a strictly modern problem, but core samples taken from ancient lake beds and dried up rivers tell a different story. Around 1250 BC, the Mediterranean began to dry up. A multi-decade megadrought set in. This wasn't just a few bad summers. This was a fundamental shift in the weather patterns that sustained the agricultural empires. We actually have the desperate receipts from this period. In the royal archives of the city of Ugarit, in modern-day Syria, we found letters sent from the Hittite Empire, the superpower of the north, begging for help. One letter chillingly reads, "Do you not know that there was a famine in the midst of my lands? It is a matter of life or death." Think about that. The Hittite king, a man who commanded thousands of chariots and ruled one of the mightiest armies on earth, was reduced to begging a subordinate city for wheat just to keep his people from starving. The breadbasket was empty, but nature wasn't done. Archaeologists have identified what they call an earthquake storm during this 50-year window. It seems that a major fault line running through Anatolia and the Aegean became hyperactive. We find evidence of city walls cracked and repaired again. The great stone fortifications of Mycenae and Troy were being rattled apart by the earth itself. So, picture the situation. You have starving populations, withered crops, and shattered infrastructure. What happens next? The social contract breaks. When the palace can no longer feed the people stop obeying the palace. We see evidence of internal uprisings. In some of the destroyed cities, the fire damage is UNT on the walls where an invader would attack EAT in the administrative centers, the tax offices, the warehouses. These weren't always foreign conquerors. Often, it was the hungry citizens burning down the institutions that had failed them. The great empires were bleeding. They were exhausted, hungry, and fighting their own populations. The complex trade network we talked about earlier began to constrict. Prices skyrocketed. The club of great powers was trying to hold on to a status quo that was rapidly disintegrating. They might have survived the drought. They might have rebuilt after the earthquakes. They might have quelled the rebellions. But they were about to run out of luck. Because just as these empires were at their absolute weakest, crouching in their damaged palaces, looking out at the horizon, the sails appeared. Section 3. The mystery of the sea peoples, invaders from nowhere, and this brings us to one of the greatest cold cases in human history. Who were they? Historians call them the sea peoples, a Victorian term coined in the 19th century. The Egyptians simply called them the Northerners coming from all lands. But names don't capture the sheer terror they inspired. Imagine standing on the ramparts of a coastal city in Syria. You look out at the Mediterranean, usually a highway for merchant ships carrying wine and oil. But today, the horizon is dark with a different kind of flotilla. These weren't standard military navies, they were a swarm. The reliefs carved into Egyptian temples depict them as a strange, confederated motley crew of warriors. Some wore horned helmets, others wore feathered headdresses. They carried round shields and long swords unlike anything the locals used. And they didn't just come by ship, they came by land. 2 ox carts, bringing their wives, their children, and their household goods. This wasn't just a raiding party. It was a mass migration. It was a moving nation of displaced people, hungry and desperate, cutting a bloody path through the civilized world. The most chilling evidence of their arrival comes from the city of Ugarit. Archaeologists found a clay tablet there, baked in the fires of the city's destruction. It was a letter written by the last king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus. It reads like a distress signal from a sinking ship. He writes, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. ... The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. It is a desperate plea for help. But here is the most haunting part. The tablet was found in the kill. It had been placed there to be fired, so it could be sent, but it never left the oven. The city was stormed, sacked, and burned to the ground before the mail could go out. The scream for help was silenced before anyone heard it. The sea peoples moved like a hurricane. They smashed into the Hittite Empire, that great superpower of the Northland, the Hittites. Weakened by famine, simply folded. The great capital of Hattusa was abandoned. They swept down the coast of the Levant, erasing cities that had stood for 1,000 years. Ash layers from this period showed total devastation. In some places, the debris is meters thick. They were unstoppable. They were the Bronze Age equivalent of a force of nature. And as the smoke cleared from the ruins of Turkey and Syria, this massive, rolling juggernaut turned its eyes toward the last prize standing, the only power left that had a chance of stopping them. They turned their ships toward Egypt. Section 4. The year 1177 BC. The battle for the Delta. The year is 1177 BC. This is the date that historians often pin to the map as the moment the old world died. Pharaoh Ramesses III was waiting for them. Unlike the Hittites or the Mycenaeans, who seemed to have been caught off guard, the Egyptians had received intelligence. They knew the storm was coming. Ramesses had watched the smoke rising from the north. He knew his trade partners had gone silent. He knew he was next. So, he did something brilliant. He didn't meet the sea peoples on the open ocean. where their swarm tactics and heavy numbers gave them the advantage. Instead, he lured them in. He allowed their fleet to enter the mouths of the Nile Delta maze of shallow canals, reeds, and mudbanks. It was a trap. As the heavy ships of the Sea Peoples navigated the narrow waterways, they found themselves stuck. They couldn't maneuver, and that is when the trap was sprung. The banks of the Nile suddenly exploded with movement. Thousands of Egyptian archers, hidden in the tall reeds, stood up. We have the record of this battle carved into the walls of the temple at Medinet Habu. It is a scene of absolute chaos. The Egyptian archers, famous for their composite bows, rained death down onto the crowded decks of the enemy ships. At the same time, Egyptian galleys rammed the stalled invaders, capsizing them, throwing the warriors into the water, where many drowned or were skewered by soldiers waiting on the shore. Ramesses III later boasted in his inscriptions, "Those who reached my boundary, their seed is not. Their heart and soul are finished forever and ever." It was a total slaughter. The unstoppable force that had burned the Hittite Empire to the ground, that had erased the Mycenaean citadels, had finally hit a wall. Egypt had won. The invasion was stopped cold. But there is no happy ending here, because while Ramesses saved Egypt from conquest, he couldn't save it from the collapse. The victory was what we call a Pyrrhic victory. The cost of the war was astronomical. The treasury was drained. The conscription of so many men took them away from the fields during harvest. The trade routes were still broken, so no gold was flowing in. Even though the Sea Peoples were defeated, the damage was done. Egypt was like a boxer who wins the match, but is beaten so badly he never fights again. Shortly after this glorious victory, we see the first recorded labor strike in history. The tomb builders in the Valley of the Kings put down their tools because the pharaoh couldn't afford to pay them. Their rations of grain. The greatest empire on earth was bankrupt. The external threat was gone, but the internal rot was just beginning. The Sea Peoples didn't conquer Egypt, but they ensured that Egypt would never be a superpower again. And with Egypt effectively taken off the board, the last pillar of the international system crumbled. Now, there was no one left to keep the lights on. Section 5. Systems failure. When trade stops, empires starve. The war was over. The Sea Peoples were scattered or dead. But peace did not bring recovery. Instead, it brought a terrifying silence. This brings us to the most critical concept in understanding the Bronze Age collapse. It wasn't just the earthquakes, or the drought, or the Sea Peoples that ended civilization. It was systems collapse. Think back to the world we described in the beginning, a finely tuned machine where every nation relied on every other nation. Egypt provided the gold, the Hittites, the military muscle, Cyprus, the copper, and distant Afghanistan, the tin. It was a masterpiece of logistics. But complex systems are fragile. When the Sea Peoples disrupted the shipping lanes, they didn't just burn a few ships, they severed the arteries of the world. Remember, this was the Bronze Age. Bronze is an alloy 9 parts copper, 1 part tin. Without tin, you don't have bronze. Without bronze, you don't have plowshares to till the fields. You don't have adzes to cut wood. You don't have spear tips to defend yourself. Suddenly, the tin stopped arriving. The supply chain snapped. Imagine if, tomorrow, all the oil pipelines in the world simply ran dry. That is exactly what happened. The oil of the ancient world vanished. The result was a catastrophic multiplier effect. With trade routes cut, the specialized economies of these great cities became useless. A city that specialized in making pottery for exports suddenly had no one to sell to, which meant they had no money to buy grain. The central administrations, the palaces, could no longer provide for their people. In a centralized economy, the king is the CEO. He collects the taxes, stores the food, and redistributes it. But when the warehouses are empty and the trade ships are gone, the CEO is fired. And in the ancient world, firing the CEO usually meant burning his house down with him inside. We see a massive digitization, the complex bureaucracy, the scribes who kept the records, the diplomats who negotiated the treaties. They became instantly obsolete. You don't need a diplomatic corps when your world has shrunk to the size of your own village. You don't need scribes to track tax revenue when there is no revenue. So, the system simply turned off. The lights went out. The great tragedy is that the very thing that made them so powerful, their interconnection, is exactly what killed them. They were too big to fail until they failed. The shock to the system was too great, and the intricate web of dependencies turned into a suicide pact. As the trade networks dissolved, The cities that depended on them began to starve, not from lack of food, but from a lack of access. The survivors didn't just lose their wealth, they lost their way of life. And as the central authorities collapsed, the people did the only thing they could do to survive. They ran. Section 6. The burning of the palaces, a tour of the ruins. If you were to take a tour of the Mediterranean around 1150 BC, a few decades after the Battle of the Delta, you would be taking a tour of a graveyard. This isn't a metaphor. Archaeologists today look for something called the destruction layer. It is a dark band of ash, charcoal, and debris that cuts through the stratigraphy of the earth. In most eras, you might find this in one city here or there, a sign of a local war or an accidental fire. But in this specific layer, the ash covers almost the entire known world. Let's look at the Greek mainland. The great citadel of Pylos, home of the legendary King Nestor, was obliterated. The heat of the fire that consumed the palace was so intense that it turned the stone walls into lime and melted the clay jars in the storerooms. But the fire did something else. Quite accidentally, it baked the clay tablets in the royal archives. These tablets were never meant to be permanent. They were temporary tax records written on raw clay, but the fire hardened them into ceramic, preserving them for 3,000 years. They are snapshots of the final moments. They list hurried preparations. The watchers are guarding the coast. Bronze is being stripped from the temple walls to make spear points, and then the records stop. The scribes dropped their styluses and ran, or died where they sat. Travel north to Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites. This was a city of temples and massive fortifications. By 1180 BC, it was empty. The royal family had packed up the treasures and fled. The buildings that remained were torched. We find arrowheads embedded in the walls and unburied bodies in the street signs of a last, desperate struggle in a ghost town. In the Levant, the city of Hazor shows signs of absolute fury. The statues of the gods were not just toppled, they were decapitated, their hands hacked off. This suggests a deep rage against the ruling elite and their religion. It wasn't just an invasion, it was a rejection of the old order. And everywhere, we find the hoards. These are heartbreaking time capsules. We find pots filled with jewelry, gold, and precious tools buried under the floorboards of houses. These were families who saw the smoke on the horizon, dug a hole, and hid their life savings, thinking, "We will hide this, run to the hills, and come back when it's safe." They never came back. The palaces that had stood as symbols of power and stability for centuries were now just blackened skeletons on the hilltops. The kings were dead or in hiding. The armies had dissolved. The great stone lions that guarded the gates of Mycenae looked out over a wasteland. The fire had cleansed the world of its complexity. But when the smoke finally cleared, the survivors realized something terrifying. The palaces were gone. Yes, but so was the knowledge they held. The hard drive of civilization had been wiped. Section 7. The long silence. Entering the Greek Dark Ages when the fires finally burned themselves out. A strange and heavy silence descended on the Aegean. We call this period the Greek Dark Ages, and for a long time, historians used that term because they thought the era was simply obscure to us, that we just couldn't see what was happening. But now we know. It was called the Dark Ages because the lights literally went out. The most shocking casualty of the collapse wasn't the buildings or the trade routes, it was the memory. In Greece, the art of writing simply vanished. The Mycenaeans had used a script called Linear B to track their taxes, their armies, and their inventories. It was a tool of the palace bureaucracy. When the palaces burned and the bureaucrats died, the script died with them. For the next 300 years, not a single word was written down in Greece. The entire culture developed a case of collective amnesia. Imagine that. A society that was literate, that had history and records, suddenly waking up one day unable to read its own past. The population plummeted. Estimates suggest that in some regions, 75 to 90% of the people disappeared. We don't know if they died of famine, disease, or war, or if they simply migrated away to the hills, living in small, isolated bands to avoid attention. The great cities were left to rot. Those who survived found themselves living in the shadow of a past they could no longer understand. Imagine a goat herder in 1000 BC, living in a simple mud brick hut, looking up at the massive stone walls of Mycenae. The stones were so huge, some weighing over 10 tons, that the survivors decided human beings could impossibly have moved them. They concluded that a race of one-eyed giants, the Cyclops, must have built them. We still call it Cyclopean masonry today. They had forgotten that it was their own great-grandfathers who laid those stones. Life became local. There were no more imported goods, no more ivory from Africa, no more lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The world shrank to the distance you could walk in a day. Pottery became simple and functional. The beautiful, intricate designs of the Bronze Age were replaced by crude geometric patterns. But in the darkness, something else was growing. Because they couldn't write, they began to speak. They began to sing. To preserve their history, the survivors wove their memories into epic songs. They told stories of a vanished golden age, of a time when men were like gods, when great kings ruled wealthy cities, and when 1,000 ships sailed to Troy. These stories were passed down, father to son, bard to bard, around campfires in the ruins of the old world. They were warped by time and memory, but the core was real. This oral tradition would survive the long, cold winter of the Dark Ages. And centuries later, a blind poet named Homer would finally stitch them together into the Iliad and the Odyssey. So, while the physical civilization collapsed, the soul of it went underground. It was incubating. The world had hit rock bottom. But the thing about hitting rock bottom is that you are forced to reinvent yourself. The Bronze Age was dead. It was time for something stronger to take its place. Section 8. From Ashes to Iron, How Collapse Birthed the Modern World. And finally, we reach the paradox at the heart of this story. The Bronze Age collapse was a catastrophe. Yes, it was a tragedy that killed millions and set progress back by centuries. But it was also the most important thing to ever happen to the West. Because here is the truth about the Bronze Age empires. They were rigid, they were top-heavy, they were societies where a tiny elite controlled all the wealth, all the trade, and all the technology. The common man was nothing more than a cog in the palace machine. If that system had survived, human history might have remained frozen in a state of permanent tyranny. But the fire burned it all down, and in the ashes, something new began to sprout. First, there was the metal itself. With the tin trade broken, the survivors were forced to innovate. They couldn't make bronze anymore, so they turned to the useless red rock that lay scattered all over the ground. Iron ore. Iron is much harder to work with than bronze. You need much higher temperatures to smelt it, but once you figure it out, it changes everything. Bronze was rare and expensive, the metal of kings. Iron is cheap and everywhere. It is the metal of the people. When you put cheap iron weapons into the hands of commoners, the balance of power shifts forever. The age of the chariot elite was over. The age of the infantry, the citizen soldier, had begun. And look at who stepped into the vacuum. In the Levant, in the hill country that used to be controlled by the Egyptian and Hittite empires, a small group of tribes finally had the breathing room to establish their own kingdom. They were the Israelites. If the great empires had still been standing, the kingdom of Israel likely would have been crushed in its crib. But in the chaos of the collapse, they survived, bringing with them a radical new idea: monotheism. On the coast, the survivors of the Canaanite trade cities became the Phoenicians. Since the old trade networks were gone, they built new ones. And to manage their business, they invented a simplified writing system, a phonetic alphabet. Unlike the complex hieroglyphs or linear B that only scribes could read, this new alphabet could be learned by anyone. They passed it to the Greeks, who passed it to the Romans, who passed it to us. And in Greece, the destruction of the palaces meant the destruction of the kings. When society slowly rebuilt itself, it didn't rebuild as a centralized empire. It rebuilt as a collection of independent city-states, the polis, and in one of those city-states, Athens, the people eventually decided that they didn't need a king at all. They invented democracy, iron, the alphabet, monotheism, democracy. These are the four pillars of the modern world, and not a single one of them was possible under the suffocating weight of the Bronze Age empires. They were all children of the collapse. So, when we look back at the year 1177 BC, we shouldn't just see it as the year civilization fell apart. We should see it as the painful, violent birth of the world we live in today. The lights went out, yes, but when they finally came back on, they were shining on a completely different stage. The apocalypse happened, and thank God it did, because without the fall, we never would have risen. The final question, so I want to leave you with one final thought. We look at the late Bronze Age world of global trade, diplomatic treaties, and complex supply chains, and we see a mirror of ourselves. They thought they were too advanced to fail. They thought their system was permanent. But if history teaches us anything, it's that civilization is fragile. It's a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark ocean. My question to you is this: if our tin stopped arriving tomorrow, if the internet went down, or the oil stopped flowing, how long do you think our society would last before the lights went out? And more importantly, what would rise from the ashes? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I read all of them. If you found this story fascinating, you might want to check out this video here, gesture to screen, where we explore the mystery of the sea peoples in even more depth. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.